Well, welcome everyone. Jeff Jensen, Director of Community Programs here with Trees Forever. Welcome back to another Stewards of the Beautiful Land webinar. This is one in a series that we're running throughout the summer and fall, and we have a great presentation today, Pollinator Palooza. Real quickly, you should be able to see and hear us, but we cannot hear or see you. And so you'll use the question tab. I'll be presenting shortly on Pollinator Palooza. We also have Sheila Weldon with us. Hi, Sheila.
Hey.
And she'll be joining us here for questions and answers. Sheila and I got together and did a little video here so that everything's recorded. We have it nice and tight. It's right at about 34 minutes. And then we'll come back with questions and answers. Again, just a reminder, you should be able to hear and see us, but we can't hear or see you. So you will use the questions tab, to go ahead and ask questions to us. Again, you can ask questions at any time, but we're going to come together at the end where we'll be answering the questions, both Sheila and I, that may have come up during the presentation. Want to encourage folks to connect with us on Facebook. We have a Stewards of the Beautiful Land Facebook group where you can stay up to date on some of the different field days and webinars, share photos. We have right now a photo call for photos if you have any good examples of water quality practices or natives growing in your backyard. So be sure to check that out. We'll be sure to post some pictures from our field days. Tomorrow we have one in Okoboji, one in Oskaloosa, so check into that. But that Facebook group is a nice way to learn with others, and then of course share with others what you might be seeing out there on the landscape. I want to encourage you to save the date for our next webinar, but it's not 2 weeks from today. It's actually 3 weeks from today because of the 4th of July holiday there. Instead of July 5th, we decided to push it to July 12th. And at that time, we'll be talking with ISU Extension Forester Billy Beck, and he's going to present on the big picture of Iowa forestry. So really excited to have Billy with us. He does some great work there with ISU Extension Forestry, from field days to answering questions, and in this case, sharing with us the big picture. This is how you can get to the Stewards of the Beautiful Land landing page on the Trees Forever website. Once there, you can get information, all the different webinars and the different field days that are scheduled for June, July, August, and September. Speaking of field days, so tomorrow, Thursday, June 22nd, we have 2 field days, one up in Okoboji. We'll be at Iowa Lakeside Labs, 5:30, a walk in the woods, and then down in Oskaloosa at the high school, again at 5:30, they'll be looking at prairies and pollinators. It'll be a great time, so come out and join us. Can't be at both, but next month, maybe you can hit the other one. So we have then, speaking of July, wanted to get this on folks' calendars because, again, the next webinar won't be until the 12th, but we have quite a few field days that are in early July. So Wednesday, July 5th in Manning, Brad Riphagen over in Carroll County, Species ID Management and Prairie Bingo. I'll be up in Hampton where we'll be talking about pollinators, plant ID, and again, playing Prairie Bingo. That'll be a lot of fun. Mains Grove Lodge near Hampton. Then on Tuesday, July 11th, we'll be in Okoboji at the Mazer Monarch Lodge, again playing some Prairie Bingo. And then down in Oskaloosa, in Mahaska County at the Quercus Wilderness area on Wednesday, July 12th. That'll be an invasive species ID and removal techniques field day, so don't miss out on that. Whew. Oh, here we go. A couple of other upcoming webinars. June 29th, we have Iowa Forest Health Assessment with Iowa DNR Forest Health Specialist Tivone Feely. So that will be great to learn about some different invasives and the overall forest health in Iowa. Then on July 28th, we have a Food Forest Forum. This is going to be a lot of fun. So myself and Gina Bulow with Trees Forever, as well as Nick McGrath, we're going to bring you a presentation on all the various things that you can eat in the forest and even in your backyards. And then on August 24th, we're going to talk specifically woodland invasive species. So be sure to check those out on the Trees Forever calendar and get registered today. Well, without further ado, let's dive into Pollinator Palooza. Welcome everyone to Pollinator Palooza, our talk today on pollinators and the habitats they depend on. To get started today, we're going to begin with a brief review of Trees Forever, then a review of what exactly we're talking about when we reference pollinators. Next, why are pollinators even important? Then we'll bring in Sheila Weldon to the conversation to chat about honeybees specifically. Then we'll get into the heart of what pollinators need to survive and thrive. And finally, suggestions for attracting pollinators to your backyard. That's our agenda for this afternoon. Grab your popcorn and a cold drink, and let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit about a great organization I work for, Trees Forever. Our mission is to plant and care for trees and the environment by empowering people, building community, and promoting stewardship. Trees Forever was founded in 1989 and since then has planted more than 3 million trees. We do this with a staff of roughly 25 working in Iowa and Illinois. We have participated in national projects and are supported by individuals like you. First, we need to set the stage for what we mean when we talk about pollinators. It is crucial to understand that while we talk about pollinators in a general term, pollinators include many, many things. Most of us are familiar with bees and butterflies, but it also includes more mundane insects like flies and beetles and moths. And let's not forget about mammals like bats, bears, and yes, even humans. And even within insects, thousands of species comprise pollinators and have varying life cycles. Since we're talking about pollinators, I think it's worth remembering just what the act of pollination entails. Pollinators transfer pollen from the male part of a plant, the anthers, to the female part of a plant, the stigma, resulting in the production of seeds and fruit. So why are pollinators important, and why the concern over population declines the last decade or so? Well, the short answer is that pollinators are crucial to a healthy ecosystem and food supply. Pollinators are sometimes thought of as the canary in the coal mine and are a key indicator of ecosystem health. The reason is because 90% of wild plants need cross-pollination to survive and reproduce. When we put pollinators into the context to the overall food system, it is estimated that pollinators are responsible for roughly every third bite of food we eat. A few facts and figures regarding pollinators and the food supply. 84% of commercially grown crops insect pollinated. Pollinators affect over a third of global ag lands. And the last one, the vast majority of pollinators are wild or native. A few facts and figures regarding pollinators and their value to society. So between 235 and 577 billion worth of annual global food production relies on direct contribution of pollinators. When we factor in U.S. wild pollination, it's estimated to be worth 10 billion annually. And then honeybee pollination alone is worth almost 20 billion annually. So we know that pollinators are important, but why are pollinators in danger? Many factors contribute to declining numbers of pollinators in general, but we know that numbers are declining. I love this photo because it shows very explicitly the importance of pollination. Now remember, insects and other pollinators do this work every day for free as part of their routine. So if they're not around to do this, someone has to. And before we giggle, that could be in the United States sometime soon if we continue down this path. So why exactly are we seeing these declines in pollinator numbers? Many factors play into population declines of pollinators. Certainly, loss of habitat and seasonal forage, exposure to pesticides and other chemicals, invasive pests and disease are a problem. And finally, a changing climate means changing landscapes. And some of these pollinators have very intimate relationships with specific plants. If we are to protect pollinators, we must know what they need and how to protect them. Basically, pollinators need four main things. They need access to forage for the entire growing season. They need access to nesting sites, protection from pesticides, and then protect undisturbed habitat so they have a place to make their homes. Well, let's start with year-long forage. Now, you remember I mentioned that when we talk about pollinators as a group, and we do this and kind of talk about them in general terms, but pollinators are comprised of thousands of different species of insects, mammals, birds, etc. Therefore, since we're trying to provide resources for all pollinators, diversity is absolutely crucial. Like in real estate, where the mantra is location, 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 the mantra with pollinators is diversity, diversity, diversity. A rule of thumb we like to suggest is including at least 3 species that bloom early, 3 that bloom during the middle of the growing season, and then 3 species that will bloom later in the fall. The reason for this is because some of these pollinator species will live their entire life cycle in the early part of the year, and some will not even emerge to start their life cycle until the middle or later parts of the year. Diversity ensures that we will have some sort of habitat for all species. Another good suggestion is to make, excuse me, another really good suggestion is to make the native seed mix heavy on the forbs and the flowers. Over time, the grasses can tend to take over. So boosting that initial level of forbs and flowers can help to overcome that. And finally, include a wide range of colors and heights. That's important as well. Sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. Pollinator habitat is much more than prairie. Perennials of all types can provide valuable habitat for forage or nesting. Next, we'll highlight a few of the trees and shrubs. Oaks are the quintessential wildlife plant, from mammals and birds to a vast diversity of insects, and then these insects become bird food. Experts believe that oak trees and forests support the most diverse flower populations outside of the jungle rainforests of the tropics. Many of these species evolved to live in the shade of oak trees. Black gum. Now, this is a dioecious. That means producing male and female flowers on separate trees. The female flowers are replaced by clusters of these kind of bluish black drupes. That's the fruit. Now, these are moderately long-lived. They get roughly 40 to 80 feet tall. They do prefer full sun to light shade. The deciduous leaves are quite colorful during the autumn. They become this golden yellow, even orange and scarlet colors, purple from time to time. And then you get these splotches of green, and then the dark drupes, the fruit that's still attached, can really make for a nice, pleasant aesthetic. Common names of this tree are also black gum, sour gum, and black tupelo. Serviceberry is native to Iowa, a great tree for bees. Serviceberry trees, also known as shadblow, sarvisberry, and shadbush. And then these trees and shrubs are members of the rose family. And I say trees and shrubs because you can get them as either form, more of a single stemmed variety, and then the multi-stemmed shrub. Buttonbush. Now, buttonbush does well in wet areas and in the garden. It is a host plant to the Promethea moth, Hydrangea sphinx, and the saddleback caterpillar. Witch hazel. This can get up to 20 feet tall. Now, it's unique in that it's the last woody plant to bloom in the fall, and it blooms for about 3 weeks, which happens after its leaves have turned yellow and fallen off. And it attracts primarily wasps and flies. Ninebark. This is a multi-stemmed shrub, 3 to 9 feet tall. The bark of the lower stems is kind of a dark brown, maybe dull orange, eventually shredding into these kind of thin strips or sheets. The young stems often terminate in round clusters of flowers about 2 to 3 inches across. It blooms in late spring or early summer for about 2 to 3 weeks. Late in the summer, the flower clusters are replaced by these drooping greenish red fruits.
I'm joined now by Sheila Weldon with Hobby Acres. Sheila has been teaching beekeeping to newbies interested in getting started with their own hives and has a wealth of knowledge about beekeeping in general and providing valuable habitat for honeybees and pollinators of all types. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you, Jeff. This is fun. I'm enjoying this, and it's kind of refreshing a lot of my beekeeping and pollinator information. So I'm enjoying this. Warning though, beekeepers sometimes start talking about bees, and we get a little carried away.
I'd like to jump right in. I just highlighted a couple of trees and shrubs that are great for pollinator habitat and an early season food source. I'm curious, what are your two favorite trees for pollinators?
Today, my favorite tree is the Japanese lilac because it's blooming, and my husband cut me a bouquet from that tree and brought it into the house, and my house just smells fantastic. Tomorrow, it probably won't be in bloom, and my favorite tree will be the lindens and the tulip trees. We have young tulip trees. I think we've got 3 out there, and this year we got some blooms from them. What I like about the tulip tree, it grows very large, very large. And what's sad is they're when they get really big, people cut them down. There was a gorgeous one, I think, over in Pella, and people, because it's so big, it makes them nervous that it's going to fall on their house at some time. So, and we live on acreage, so those were some trees that we wanted to plant. And it was kind of sweet to see a tree, because I'd heard that it take like 20 years actually before they start producing blooms, but ours, they've probably been in the ground, I don't know, maybe 15 years, I'm thinking. The linden, though, is actually my favorite, and we've planted some, and those are not producing blooms yet. And then the largest tree on our diameter of the trunk and everything is a linden tree, an American linden tree. There's a lot of reasons I like lindens. The linden tree is fragrant. I love planting plants and trees that have a fragrance. And like when I mentioned the Japanese lilac tree, what I like about it, like it's blooming now, but it smells like springtime when the lilacs are blooming. But the linden trees, their blooms hang down. So if you have a lot of rain, frequent rains, it's not as apt to wash out the nectar. That's one of the problems when we have frequent rains, because different plants, different trees, it takes them a while to recover their nectar. Some plants or trees, it's like once the nectar's gone, it's gone. It's not there again. And there's a lot of different varieties of lindens, and they each have their own little reasons why people like them. You know, most people are not planting American lindens on their property because, again, it's a large tree. They don't want it to fall on their house. But there's so many. Pella has a lot of linden trees that they've used for landscaping over there. And a lot of the trees will be fragrant. When I talk about trees for honeybees or other pollinators, the most important thing I think to think about is that large trees, it's like having acres of blooms in the sky. You know, you plant a little patch of something here on the ground, some of your pollinators are going to, but for honeybees, um, their colonies are so large, they need a lot of resources. Now, the honeybee is not native to our country. The Europeans brought it over here, the European honeybee. But because of the way our food supply is, and especially with the large monocultures, we need our honeybees. We need to get them to work for us. And but anyway, so that's the advantage of having these really large trees that are just full of blooms, and they bloom at different times. And that's why I probably like the linden and the tulip tree, because of their size.
Tell me, how is honey made?
Okay. The honey comes from the nectar that the bees are gathering. Now, the bees basically send out Scout. Scout goes out and finds, I always called it their gold mine, because they're looking for that big, normally they're looking for a big tree that's got a lot of blooms that they can get a lot of nectar from. And they go out there, the bee finds, the scout comes back, does the little dance, and next thing you know, that tree is just a buzz with honeybees gathering nectar. We have out here at our house, we have like a cherry tree, ornamental cherry tree, and it's just loaded with blooms in the spring. And I went out there earlier on the deck, and I could just hear all these bees, and there wasn't any wind. And it was just really neat to hear all that activity in that tree. And so they gather that, they take it back to their hive. And usually they are gathering it, especially in the spring, they are gathering all of that nectar so they can mix it with the pollen and then feed the developing larva. And then, so most of the food is immediately going into that. And then I guess you'd say the leftover honey, because they need to collect a lot of honey to get them through the winter and the rest of the summer. So they're collecting throughout the summer. In fact, a honeybee, the last job of their life, their little short-lived life, is a forager, and they basically work themselves to death. Their wings get real ratty, and when they die outside the hive. But they gather all of that, and then they dry it down, and they consume it and feed those resources to the young, and they consume it themselves throughout the winter. If we steal too much honey from them, and that's what we're doing, when we harvest honey, we're stealing the honey from the bees. Sadly, it's almost a standard practice sometimes to remove a lot of honey from the bees, and the beekeepers have to feed the honey. Or not feed honey, they have to feed the bees, but they feed them high fructose corn syrup. Now, we really don't like to do that. We never really did do that. And we were always very cautious not to harvest too much from them. But that is a real common practice, and especially in commercial beekeeping, is to take as much honey as you can and then feed the bees back sugar water or high fructose corn syrup. So who knew that people were feeding their bees, right?
You mentioned nectar flow, and I'd like to pick up on that. Could you talk to me about nectar flow?
Different plants produce nectar at different times. Trees, they'll have their nectar flow. They need the nectar because the bees are in the spring, they're very busy collecting pollen. Our maple trees, for example, I wish I had recorded this one earlier this year, because we have a maple tree outside our yard, and it was just, you could hear the buzz of the bees in this maple tree. Well, there's no nectar there, but maples produce a lot of pollen. And so the bees, especially in the spring, they're building up their population, and they're getting the pollen, and they're taking the pollen back to their hive. They'll mix it with some of the nectar or the honey in the hive and their own body secretions, and they'll mix that, and that's what they feed their babies, that developing larva that's growing inside the hive. So and the pollen is one of the most nutrient dense proteins that we or the insects can consume. It it's microscopic. We really can't see the pollen. But the bees, they have that hair and fuzzy stuff all over their body. So when they're flying around, they're gathering up that pollen on their body, and then they kind of pack it into little cluster balls on each, like a load. They'll have a load on each side of their body, these nice round balls of pollen, and they bring that back to the hive. And that's what they're doing with the pollen. And then, of course, they're mixing the nectar, and they have to dry that nectar down because nectar is very runny. And as hive progresses in the season, they dry that nectar down to where it needs to be at least less than 19% moisture. If it's higher than that, the honey will ferment and turn into mead. That's how mead is. It's basically nectar or honey that's got too much moisture in it. And that's how people, I have never made mead. I have tasted it, never made it.
Wow, great information. Sheila, I heard a term a while back that I wasn't familiar with, floral fidelity. What is that? Can you educate me on the topic?
Well, people often plant plants or even trees for the honeybees. And then they make a comment, they say, I never see bees on my plants. They never see the honeybees. Well, usually, like I've mentioned, the bees are seeking that gold mine. And so they find that gold mine. All the bees go to the gold mine and they work that gold mine till it's dry. So usually, like, one day, that's what they're doing. They're working that gold mine. And for example, almonds. Now, that's the floral fidelity is why we like our honeybees. It is the only insect that we really manage and that we need um, for our food supply, and especially with all the monocultures. The best monoculture and where the money is on bees is sending our beehives to, no, we never did send ours, but people send their beehives to California. They go over there on semi-loads and they put these pallets down that have about 4 hives on them, and they have them in the almond orchards. And what's really strange is they're there to pollinate. All those bees have been transported because they are going to work those hives. Well, what's sad is they have to feed the bees to do that because there's no nectar there in those almonds. Most of the time, it's very rare that there would be any nectar. So they're just there to pollinate and move the pollen around and take it back to the hive. So they have to feed them when they're doing that. There's no other insect that we can work like that and that will do that kind of a job for us because you need so many of them. And that's why they're like, well, migratory beekeepers. The bees are migratory. They're going up crisscrossing all across the country, pollinating services. And if we don't have our honeybees for the food supply, especially a lot of the foods that we enjoy eating, but there are people actually working on robots, little robots to do this work because they think down the road we're not going to have our honeybees. Imagine that world.
Well, folks, I guess it's true. You'll learn something new every day. And that is precisely why we bring you these webinars and knowledgeable experts like Sheila who've done it and can share their experiences. Sheila, thank you so much. We're going to see you real soon during questions and answers.
Shifting back to some great species for pollinators. Here are a few grasses that are great, and then some of my favorite forbs that are also great habitat for pollinators. Grasses like Sideoats grama provide valuable nesting habitat for ground nesting pollinators that require undisturbed areas for the labyrinth of tunnels and chambers they use to lay their eggs. Prairie dropseed. This is one of my favorites. It looks nice as a bunch grass, kind of growing in attractive clumps, but it also smells like buttered popcorn when you cut it in the summer. Little blue stem. The foliage provides food for caterpillars for a variety of the skippers. really common in our prairies and here in Iowa. Now to get into some of the colorful forbs, golden alexanders are attractive to many kinds of insects looking to get pollen and nectar, especially short-tongued bees, wasps, flies, and beetles. The plant is capable of self-pollination if no pollinators are present. Now, some folks confuse golden Alexander with wild parsnip, which is this weedy biennial that is taller and it blooms later in the year and has more leaflets on each compound leaf. But for golden Alexanders, the caterpillars of the black swallowtail and Ozark swallowtail feed on the leaves and flowers, and the mining bee, that's a specialist of golden Alexanders. Oh, wow. Yes. The showiest of all the milkweeds due to its color and the long summer bloom time, butterfly milkweed. Monarch caterpillars do eat the leaves like the common milkweed. It is the host plant to the monarch butterfly, queen butterfly, and the milkweed tussock moth. The foliage lacks that toxic, milky kind of latex that typically oods from the other milkweeds. And then other names. It's also known as pleurisy root for its medicinal purposes in treating pleurisy. Basically, people ate the bitter tasting roots as a remedy. Oh, wow. Another just phenomenal colored species here. This is Liatris, blazing star, stunning prairie flower. It blooms toward the end of summer, early autumn, providing some excellent forage during a crucial time of the year, late in the season. Speaking of late in the season, New England aster. Now, male bees are a common visitor. They feed on the nectar while waiting to mate with the females. Kind of what Sheila said with hanging out at the bar. They must be hanging out on the aster plants. New England aster is a larval host plant for the pearl crescent butterfly and the Canadian Sonia moth. It provides pollen and nectar to a variety of bees, flies, beetles, skippers, you name it. Okay, the next critical item for pollinators is access to nesting sites. So pollinators can be cavity nesters or ground nesters. Now, cavity nesters use these naturally occurring crevices or bore holes created by others to lay their young in these different chambers. The ground nesters use a system of tunnels and chambers to house their eggs and larvae. This is fascinating. Of our roughly 4,000 native bee species, 70% nest in the ground, and they only travel 200 to 300 yards. So this is why providing undisturbed areas is so crucial for pollinator habitat. These are interesting. Pollinator bee houses or hotels, sometimes they're referenced as. These are structures made up of these different natural materials that accommodate these solitary nesting bees and other pollinators by providing the cavities for them to live in and raise their young. So when building a bee house, use untreated lumber, certainly, and then make the holes in the wood roughly 6 to 8 inches deep using varying sizes because, of course, bees come in all sorts of different sizes. The bee house needs to have a roof with at least a 2-inch overhang protecting the holes and the hollow stems from the rain. The habitat house that's shown here is made of layers of pallets. And then in between the pallets are bricks, wood, kind of log pieces, flower pots containing all sorts of hollow plant stems and pine needles, pine cones, and other natural materials. This habitat is actually going to be used by insects and actually birds, amphibians, reptiles, and even mammals too. It's really hard to see, but on the dead branch in the upper right-hand corner of the house, there is a praying mantis. Fascinating. Okay, we need to be thinking about some common sense things to protect pollinators and other beneficial insects from pesticides and other chemicals. This may sound like preaching to the choir a little bit, but you all know this is true and it bears repeating. For those that don't know, the label is the law. Read it and abide by it. For example, Often to avoid exposing insect pollinators to pesticides, timing of application is spelled out on the label relative to the blooming stage of the crop and other plants. Similarly, follow all pesticide label requirements regarding application conditions. Think of things like wind speed, wind direction, temperature, and relative humidity. They can all have an effect. Again, some common sense steps can go a long way to minimizing drift and undue exposure. Finally, we need to provide undisturbed habitat to provide overwintering habitats, nesting habitats that is, and protect pollinators and other beneficial insects from pesticides and other chemicals. So undisturbed areas, absolutely vital for pollinator habitat. Dead trees, brush piles, tall grass, ground litter, all provide crucial homes for these little critters. For example, the queen rusty-patched bumblebee, which is a species of concern in Iowa, spends its winters hunkered down in about 3 centimeters of dirt under the duff layer in the woods. And this is enough, it insulates them enough to be nice and toasty during the harsh winter. Oh boy, I love this picture. One of my favorites. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So standing perennials provide the habitat pollinators need. Here is a leafcutter bee larvae, warm and toasty inside of a stem, waiting for the days to get longer and spring to arrive. So what can you do on your farm to attract pollinators? Well, it all begins with understanding right plant, right place. Know your piece of ground. Is it high and dry or low and moist? This will influence the species composition that will thrive in that particular area. What is the underlying soil type? And is the site in full sun or partial shade? To the extent you can, strive for local ecotype seed and plant a range of diverse plant sizes, from the large cup plant and compass plant to rattlesnake master and lead plant. Be an advocate for pollinators. Talk to your neighbors, friends, and family about the importance of native plants. Create corridors of plantings throughout your block or neighborhood. Talk to your local elected officials. Plant rain gardens or butterfly gardens throughout the community on public property, and just overall be involved. I really want to stress and thanks to our partners, the USDA, FS, Operation Pollinator, Syngenta. All of these made this presentation possible. With that, we'll get to questions and answers. Okay, fantastic. Well, I think we'll get right into it. Sheila, if you want to hop on here, we're going to get to the questions section and see what folks have for us. Okay, so right off the bat here, Sheila, Joe wants to know, so what exactly is floral fidelity?
Well, that's why we can work bees as pollinators. They go to that specific almond tree, work it till it's gone. Pretty much the whole hive will go and do that. And then as the season drags on and the bloom times, then you'll start seeing your bees out there just going to wherever they can find food. But the floral fidelity is basically when the whole hive is working a particular tree or plant. Now, the other thing that's kind of different and I didn't mention this, but you can sometimes get honey from maybe like just 1 or 2 species of trees. For example, linden honey. If you have a lot of linden trees in your area, you can get honey from those linden trees. And if you harvest it at the right time, like soon after those trees have bloomed, you'll get like a monofloral type honey. They do that with buckwheat, for example, which is hard to get, very difficult to get buckwheat, but it really has a unique flavor. It's like the whole grains of honey. It's probably the healthiest honey you can get. And you see it even in Alaska, fireweed honey, where the bees have went out there and they've just got all this firewood. That is probably one of the most expensive honeys in this country to get. Somebody brought me back a little jar and they haven't even opened it yet, you know. It's just a little teeny pricey jar. But does that help explain that? You know, it's a monofloral honey, floral fidelity.
Say that again. What's that expensive honey, Sheila?
Fireweed.
Fireweed.
Fireweed honey. Fireweed from Alaska. It's like this plant that it's in bloom in Alaska, you know, and it's very unique. I mean, who knew they even had honeybees up there? And I haven't even opened this little jar somebody brought to me. I haven't even tasted it. It's such a little jar, and it was pretty pricey. So, and then, you know, there's these unique honeys. The linden is minty. The black locust tree can make a nice one. And there's different traits, like with the black locust, it's slow to crystallize. The honey that they get and nectar they're getting from fruit trees it crystallizes very quickly. Usually it's going to raise their brood. You go down different parts of the country when I travel, I come back with honey from that area.
Cool.
And beekeepers often do that. And when we were having our monthly meetings and things for our club, people would bring in honey when they traveled and we would taste it and it would have a different taste. But most of the honey here is, you know, it's just all mixed up. We don't have those monofloral honeys too often, but you can get them down in Florida too, a monofloral citrusy honey. So,
got it.
Yeah.
Here's a
Hopefully
question.
that helps.
Here's a question, Sheila. Let's see if you can maybe help answer this one. Alex wants to know, what can we do if we don't own property or maybe live in a city or in an apartment? Are there any just flowering plants like in pots that folks could grow that would be good for pollinators? Or I don't know.
You know, and that's tough. It depends on the size of your city. The reality is, you know, we're here in Iowa. Sometimes there is better habitat in the cities than there is in rural Iowa, which is really sad. And I use Google Earth to go in. Lots of times when beekeepers would want to put a hive on their property, I would go into Google Earth and look at that land at a certain time of the year. Say things are starting to green up, but your row crops aren't in yet. That tells you a lot about an area. Because if there's a lot of row crops, there's often not a lot of habitat. And we've had to do field trips, and then we go in there and like, there is no food here. And some of the people then started planning habitat for them. You know, it's harder in a city, but, you know, like I think of Pella. Pella has a lot of habitat. The only concern I have basically over there is if they're buying plants and putting plants out that have the neonicotinoids, the systemic pesticides, because that is a big problem with the plants that people buy. If I was going to say anything, if you know, make sure when you buy plants, whether you're getting them in a pot or buying them, ask them if they've got neonicotinoids. Most of the time they're not going to know. But there's been a period of time sometimes where some of the suppliers, you know, some of the chains, I think Home Depot was one of them. I remember going in and they did not have plants that had been treated with the neonicotinoids. And that's a systemic pesticide that has a chronic impact on our pollinators. It's kind of like a slow death. They get disoriented and they can't find their way back home. But you know, you can put out plants. I can't guarantee that you would have honeybees on it. Or if you want pollinators, like butterflies, they're host plants. We have a shortage of host plants for so many of our butterflies. So hopefully that helps either confuse you or help you.
Let's see here. Okay, Mary Ellen wants to know, okay, I have carpenter bees.
Very young.
They are very destructive. How can I provide them a nesting habitat that is not my shed or my upright beams or the wood in my shed?
Oh, yeah. Wow. Because your shed's going to have some wood in it, and they like that wood. I'm not aware that we have a problem with carpenter bees. They look like bumblebees. Um, and we have a couple of buildings where we do get them. We put out the traps. Most of you may be familiar with those traps. When it's a real problem is I have a friend in North Carolina that has a log house. It is a problem. And they can't, she'll put out the traps, but she has to hire someone to come in and plug the holes. I don't think there's a simple solution. Yeah, every so often she has to have somebody come there and work the outside of the house and plug all those holes. Another reason, yeah. And the log houses today are not made out of old growth wood like those little cabins that you see in the,
Okay.
when you're traveling, those old ones.
Is there a hierarchy of wood that they like? Are there some species of wood that they like over others necessarily, or
Well, I don't imagine they like treated wood.
good point.
But I'm not aware and the only reason I mentioned the old growth is because the log cabins from a long time ago were made out of the American chestnut trees. That's what most of them were. And, if you know the history of the American chestnut trees, it's like that when the Chinese chestnut trees came over here, they brought the problem. And then what was it, in the 30s? They were gone, for a period of, that's one of the worst climate catastrophes that we've had in our country, the disappearance of the American chestnuts. And but I don't, it was like carpenter bees really, I don't believe have worked that old growth trees. They're gone. Those trees are gone. So I digress a little bit. Now, Mary Ellen, I don't have a simple answer.
We'll have to
Other
get
than
back to you on
hang a
that
few
one.
traps to control them. I don't know what the natural enemy would be for that carpenter bee. I don't know. I don't know if birds really go after them. They're very territorial too. We always have a few around our house, like on our deck, and they just fly all day long. They just fly back and forth. Or like on the front porch, they're flying back and forth. And, I've never ever been stung by one. So I assume they have stingers.
Well, Joe has provided a link here to a site where you can purchase fireweed, prairienursery.com. And so I'll include that in the follow-up email to folks when I send the link for the recording. And speaking of that, just a reminder, this will be recorded, and we'll get this posted to YouTube here within the next couple of days, certainly, and then send out an email with the link to everybody that registered. I know there was a couple of emails for folks who really wanted to attend but couldn't. Let's see here for additional questions. Okay, now this is talking about pesticides. What's the best way to go about ensuring that my new shrubs aren't hit by drift? Great question.
Oh,
Depends on where you're at, but ultimately the best thing is communication. So, for instance, if you live out on an acreage out in the countryside, surrounded by row crops, or maybe you're on the edge of town where your property abuts some row crops, it's absolutely crucial that you reach out and find out who that landowner is, so that you can communicate that you have XYZ there, whether it's bees, whether it's sensitive plants, might be orchard crops or something like that, so that they know that. And then also being proactive and reaching out to the local elevator as well. I'd also put a plug in for Field Watch, and that's a website where you can actually, anybody can go ahead and register and go in there and on a map select your property, identify it as to what you're growing, and or if you have hives there, what the sensitivity is. Correct. Yep. And then that is kind of this almost this public record, and that's supposed to be then checked by farmers, by agronomists, by applicators, by the local co-op, so that when they go out, by aerial operators, so that when they go out, they know what's out there and what they should be aware of. And of course, it's all so that they can not apply those things when it's either too windy or in close proximity to where you're at, and some of those things. So great question, absolutely, in terms of protecting the bees and other pollinators from the pesticides, and some things that you can do to be proactive. Yeah.
I want to throw something in there a little bit.
Sure.
Okay. Beekeepers, because this is a big problem for beekeepers. The spray, the herbicides technically are not supposed to be a problem for the bees, but they are. Okay. Field watch, I've been doing it long enough where we've had different registries, but we register our beehives. And I wonder if I could register my native bees. It would be nice. I just had that little idea in my head. So we go on there and we do it every year. You have to renew it every year. And we usually try and do it in January and tell them where our hives are. And it is my understanding the only people that really have to look at field watch, at least regarding the bees, and I don't know, but it's the applicators, the commercial applicators. I do not believe the farmer, if he's going to do his own spraying, I don't know that he has to look at it unless the rules have changed.
Which is exactly why it's so important to communicate. And that's exactly why I started with that, is knowing who your neighbors are, and just, hi, I'm XYZ. This is what I have planted there. I know you farm and you're going to be doing these operations. I just want to let you know that, I've got a hazelnut test plot here. And these are very valuable plants because they're to get them as clones, or and that's why it's not enough essentially to do the field watch piece, but another step in the overall strategy to communicate that. So,
and we also have signs, several signs like no spray signs, and we got those, and they're metal signs, so they've been there forever. And I think we get them from, it was either, whatever existed before field watch. So I got ours a long time ago, but I think you can get those signs through there, no spray signs.
Nice.
Okay, and put those around the perimeter of your property. That might help. But
another follow-up question here. Any good resources for finding which insects like which plants? I'd like to plant things that are appealing to many bees, beetles, etc., but also know which specific plants certain insects like. Great question. And one resource, we do have a Trees Forever publication, kind of based on some of Doug Tallamy's work, that lists some of those tree and shrub species, and then what some of those species are that they're hosts for, and things like that. I think also that the pollinator ID booklets that Trees Forever distributes through the Living Roadway Trust Fund, I believe that some of those pollinators also have a little reference to some of the plants that they might prefer or be attracted to. So I'll try to include a link for those documents as well in that follow-up email. Great question, and we'll see if we can get that right to you there. That was Van. Thanks for that question. And a follow-up here from Joe, saying that according to the University of Kentucky, carpenter bees prefer unpainted, weathered wood, especially softer varieties such as redwood, cedar, cypress, and pine. Painted or pressure-treated wood is much less susceptible to attack. The common carpenter bee nesting sites include, here you go, Mary Ellen, eaves, rafters, fascia boards, siding, wooden shakes, roofs, decks, outdoor furniture, stuff like that. So, okay, right in line with your experience. So, maybe some paint? Let us know how that works out, Mary Ellen. Let's see here.
Good luck.
Well, we're coming to the end of, another comment here. Most pesticides have a use-by date, so be sure that you know what that use-by date is. Again, the label is the law, so be checking those labels for any of those products that you're going to be applying to the garden, the field, even your lawn. So, well, I think we're coming to the end here. I don't see any other questions. If you have any, type them in now. Just a reminder that we'll be back here in 3 weeks for a presentation on the big picture of Iowa forestry with Billy Beck. That will be exciting. In the meantime, check out the Stewards of the Beautiful Land webpage because that has all the information for some of the field days that are coming up here in early July. I hope to see you at one or some of those, certainly. Oh, and now we have a few more questions coming in here. Are wasps pollinators? Yes, Mary Ellen.
Yes.
Wasps are pollinators. They will visit different flowers and contribute to pollination. Another great reference, homegrownnationalpark.org. Thank you, Amy. I will put that link with everybody. BJ says carpenter bees, woodpeckers, strikes, and bee eaters eat carpenter bees. Citronella and vinegar
I have
diluted.
a few of those.
Might be something that you could do. Do the Japanese beetle rob the linden tree's nutrients from the bees? No, I don't think that that's going to be an issue so much as the defoliation of the Japanese beetles on those linden plants. And then Amy says, I missed the first half hour. How do I link for viewing after today? Thanks. We will send a link. I will send a link once we have it posted to YouTube. And that'll go out to everybody who registered because there was a handful of folks that couldn't make it. And so we'll be sure to get that out. And then I'll include some of the links that I referenced here in that email so that you can dive a little deeper into Pollinator Palooza. So really want to thank Sheila, absolutely, for attending here and joining us, providing your expertise. Just a lot of great stuff. Want to thank everybody else for joining us here today. Looking forward to seeing you in 3 weeks, July 12th. And hey, stay cool, everyone. Stay cool. Bye now. Howdy, folks. We have a little bonus footage from my interview with Sheila Weldon. It's a little segment I like to call Did You Know?
Did you know that in the beehive colony, there's basically 3 types of bees? We have the male bee, the drone, and we have the female bees, lots of them, and they're the workers, and then there's one queen. The drones are the male bees, and they don't do any of the work. They're they don't have a stinger, so they can't protect the hive. They basically, during the day, they go out and hang around in a drone congregation area, which is often referred to as the bar. And it's usually high up in the air, and it's like where all the drones around gather, waiting for that queen that's going to come by and mate with them. And kind of like the black widow, only the queen, or the bees don't kill them, but these drones kind of lose a body part in the process and they die. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that either. Yeah. Okay, that was the drone. Did you know that the worker bees are all females? They all have a stinger, and when they're born, they basically come out of that little cell. They clean their cell. They might clean the cells too of the drones, because the drones are not going to clean their cells. So they clean their cells, and then they immediately start taking care of the other brood, the developing larva. They have different tasks. So when the worker bee is young, she's kind of like a caregiver, a nurse bee, basically is what we call her. And she takes care of the other bees. Somebody has to feed them. And somebody has to feed the drones too, because I don't even think they can feed themselves. So that's her job. And they'll take care of all those for a while. And then the last stage of their life, they go out and forage. And when they're foraging, I think I've mentioned earlier that they are flying, and bees can fly probably. They may go 1.5 to 2 miles from a hive for food, looking for food, but it's not feasible because they're consuming a lot of resources when they have to go that far. But they literally are working themselves to death. When they and eventually they die, and they'll die outside the hive. They I want to say about the worker bees. They just have all these different jobs that they do, and foraging is they don't really live all that long. They in the summer months they're only living maybe 45 days. So they're always babies in the hive, except in the a couple of months in the winter. There's no young in there. But they just literally work, and they work for the good of the whole hive. It's really the ultimate organism because they work together so well. Did you know that the life cycle, the honeybee, is very short? Um, During the summer months, we're talking 45 days. And because they've worked themselves to death, the female, the worker bees. The queens, though, they can live for years, a few years easily. And we've had them live for 3 and 4 years, the queens. And the drones, they really don't live very long. Even if they never mate with the female, when winter is coming, the worker bees decide they want to keep the worker bees, and they have decided that the drones, they get kicked out of the hive. They don't get to winter over with what we call the winter bees. The female bees will, we call them winter bees. They stay with the hive. They don't hibernate. They go into, can't think of the word right now, but it's where they're like, their body, the temperature and everything slows down. They're not hibernating, but they just become very slow and survive through the winter, that and consuming the resources that they've got. And they're not going, and then so they have to raise new drones the next spring and then start it all over again. And their main job is to take care of the queen. The workers in the winter, they'll always be around the queen, trying to keep her warm. And that is the number one, that trying to keep a healthy queen and keep her alive, because if they don't have a queen, they die. Because queen is the one that lays all the eggs and all of the brood and enables the hive to survive and procreate. Did you know in the winter the bees will stay warm? Consuming the resources, the honey helps them stay warm. Now, and that state that they go into is, remember now, is called torpor, Torpor, if anybody wants to look it up. But they're in this state and they crawl around, they're not flying. However, when a worker bee knows that she's going to die, she actually will leave the hive. In the winter, they do what we call cleansing flights. They go out of the hive to do their business on a warm day. When it warms up enough, they can go out and fly, and then they'll come back in. But that worker bee that knows that she's close to death, she will, if she's able, go out of the hive and die in front of the hive. So whenever you see like a hive in the winter and you'll see dead bees in front of it, those were the bees that their time was done, and they choose to go outside because they don't want their sisters to have to clean up their dead body and take them out. And so they, it's again, they're thinking of the greater good and the colony. Yeah, there's a lot of unique things about honeybees. They're just fascinating. There's only one queen normally in a hive.
Got it.
That queen, and if you catch a swarm, for example, there's one queen in that swarm. A swarm, especially in the spring, that's when the bees want to reproduce. If it's a strong hive coming out of winter and you don't do a split, you don't do an intervention, it will swarm. And I've seen some really monster swarms coming from some monster hives. But the old queen, and she may not be old, she could just be last year's queen. But if it was a strong colony, and that queens lay up to 2,500 eggs a day, they can. So that's a lot of babies to take care of. And so a hive swarms, but before it swarms, that queen that was in there that went with the swarm, she will have laid some eggs there, and the bees know, they communicate in the hive by smell, pheromones. That's everybody knows that bees dance. I think they learned that in school, that they tell the other bees where the gold mine is. But they also communicate, the hive is dark, it's dark inside there. So the main communication that's happening in the hive is by smells and pheromones. And the queen releases a lot of them, but there's a lot of that going on. So they know that the hive is too big for whatever reason, we're going to reproduce. And this is how a hive reproduces, is by swarming. So that queen starts laying cells, and these cells actually get to where they look like peanuts, and they're fed royal jelly. You've all heard about royal jelly. The only time they use royal jelly is when they feed it to a larva that they know is going to become a queen. And I've seen hives with 30 queen cells in them, and they may be at different stages of development, but ultimately only one of those is going to emerge and become a queen, one of those cells. So that life cycle is just fascinating. The first queen to emerge usually goes around, and she has a stinger, but when she stings something, that queen bee, it's not a barbed stinger, so it doesn't lose its body part, and you're like a worker honeybee. When she stings you, that stinger is going to stay in there, and it's got a venom sac on it. You want to get that thing off. But she'll go around, and she will literally use her stinger and kill all those other, her plan anyway is to kill all of the other developing queens. But there's always exceptions. We have opened up cells, and there's been a couple of instances where we've found 2 queens, and the hive doesn't do well because there's too many queens, and they just don't do well. But yeah, it's fascinating learning those life cycles, and just watching how these hives grow and develop. And we still have Jerry, my husband, is primarily taking care of the bees now, and I think we have 6 hives, and and that's plenty. 6 is plenty for us at this stage of life.
Thank you, Sheila, for sharing with us all of your knowledge. Have a great day, everyone.